193. I hope by this time next week we'll be on Freedom Fighter. There was a chance that we could have been on it by the end of this or last week, but it didn't work out. But they've done all the testing on the lines and everything is in shape. And hopefully they're already starting to do some service work, running some service lines to people in our area. And I talked to the contractors that are doing it, and hopefully we'll be in really good shape with our internet and our Facebook Live broadcast and streaming and the broadband that's in the building. Really looking forward to that. All right, on page 193, kind of feel we need to go back now. Put your thumb at 193 and turn back to the top of page 188, because we're still in a discussion on a particular matter of biblical interpretation. But I want us to go back to the introductory statement. We're at the top of page 188. That says, another source of differences of interpretation and application of New Testament teaching is found in the failure to understand the nature of Jesus' teaching. The nature of any message is determined by the source from which it comes, the one by whom it is sent, and the character of the person or people to whom it is sent. Now, over to page 193. One of the causes for this failure of people to understand or recognize the difference is they fail to recognize the difference between the law of Moses and the law of Christ. And so, as we think about the difficulties associated with biblical interpretation, one of the main problems that people have in arriving at proper conclusions about what the Bible teaches is because they fail to make a distinction between the Old Testament and the New Testament. By the way, did anybody? I know that a lot of y'all are on social media, and by the way, if you're like me, that most of the stuff that comes up in your feed is by basically conservative writers. In other words, if there's something that just pops up in your feed, there's a really popular writer right now and blogger named Matt Walsh. Matt Walsh, very conservative guy. He works, I believe he works also now with CRTV, maybe with Stephen Crowder or with Levine, but Mark Levine. But he's a conservative writer. He's a very conservative guy. He writes mostly about matters pertaining to the decay of the social fabric and things like that. But he wrote a very widely read and circulated piece. I know Kyle saw it, and I think Lex saw it, that Andy Stanley, who is if you know Charles Stanley from I don't know where, he may have been from Atlanta as well, but Charles Stanley, well-known TV preacher for years and years, and his son Andy Stanley pastors a church in the Atlanta area, big church, TV. By the way, Andy Stanley's a really good preacher, all right? And I've read some of his writings about preaching, his books about preaching, and they're really good. He's a very, very effective communicator. And Stanley came under fire from Matt Walsh this week because Stanley made the statement that Christians need to unshackle themselves from the Old Testament. And Walsh and some of those people were just apoplectic, man. They just like to have a stroke. I mean, and Walsh wrote a blog piece that's probably been read, I'm guessing, hundreds of thousands of times in the last week. And he called Andy Stanley a wolf in sheep's clothing. Because Andy Stanley dared say that Christians need to get out from under the Old Testament. Now, some other things that Stanley said, I went and read the article. I went back and read the article. I went to the source and read Stanley's article as it was written, and not just what Walsh quoted. And by the way, he quoted Stanley correctly. Now, Stanley made some other statements that were problematic, for example, or made a statement that was problematic in that he said that the old law the old law was done away with, and that the only law that Christians have today is to love one another as Christ has loved them. All right, now that's important, but it's not the only thing Christians are obligated to do. And just to be perfectly honest, I don't think he really meant what he said when he wrote that, because I've heard him preach too many times. But the idea that a man would say such a thing and create such a controversy and a firestorm tells us that most of the religious world today has no concept of the division of the covenants. Because if Walsh can write this and be forwarded or shared or whatever hundreds of thousands, maybe even at this point maybe 1 million times, then it should be evident to us that most people have no concept about the division of the covenants. Alexander Campbell left the Scottish Presbyterian Church and was associated with the Redstone Baptist Association in the 1820s. And the reason was that somebody told him he needed to be associated with somebody. And he rejected the Presbyterian view of God and the nature of man and the theology. Shannon, this is not it, of Calvinism. That's not the one I was talking about. But he rejected all that, and he believed in immersion. And so he just associated himself with a group of immersionists. Well, in about 1832, at the gathering of the Redstone Baptist Association, Campbell preached a sermon on the two covenants. The two covenants, wherein he preached the distinction between the Old Testament and the New. And it created an uproar. And they took measures to kick him out of the Redstone Baptist Association for preaching that there was a difference between the Old Testament and the New Testament. And he says, I'll just save you the trouble. I quit. And he never associated, as far as I know, associated himself with any other formal religious group. But I said that to just give you an idea that this is a long-standing problem. And Campbell preached it in 1832 and created a great controversy. And Andy Stanley preached it in 2019 and created the same controversy among religionists in America. Now look, I understand. In this audience today that's in front of me right now, I know I'm preaching to the choir. I know that we all understand these things. But there'll be a lot of people that are watching on Facebook Live that do not understand these things. And as Brother West, who recorded, Brother Earl West, who wrote 5 volumes called The Search for the Ancient Order, and commenting about the time in which Campbell preached the sermon on the two covenants, he said that people would, in defense of their religious beliefs, quote as readily from one testament as they would the other. In other words, it was as if there was no difference between the two. Now, looking back to page 193, Stroop is going to introduce some of the reasons why it is a problem not to recognize the difference between the covenants. And first and foremost, now obviously we all know that the Old Covenant was given to the Jews and only to the Jews. Deuteronomy 5, 1-5 is crystal clear. God did not make this covenant, with our fathers, but even with all of us who are alive here this day. So only the Jews were the recipients of the law of Moses. All right? But there's a misunderstanding. Where Stroop's going to go is not in the sense that what we all understand, that we all know that it was given only to the Jews. But Stroop is going to delve into the nature of the Old Covenant as it was given to the Jews and why it was given to them as it was. Note, in the third line down below where the paragraph begins in 193 of one of the causes, about the start of the third line there says, as we have already observed, the law of Moses was given to a rebellious and an unfaithful people. Remember, we did a study, it's been several weeks ago now, and it was something that I had learned as well, that I always thought that the Jews were faithful to God even when they were in Egyptian captivity. And Stroop opened my eyes to that passage in Ezekiel that said that the Jews were practicing the religion of the Egyptians. They were idolaters while they were in Egypt. They were not faithful to God. First of all, they didn't have a written law. But Abraham didn't have a written law either, and he was faithful to God. And Isaac didn't have a written law, and he was faithful to God. You know, and Jacob and his sons didn't have a written law, and they were faithful to God. The Jews did not have a written law during their sojourn in Egypt. They still could have been faithful to God, but they were not. And so we have to understand the nature of the people to whom the law was given. Again, a wicked and rebellious people. And then note the next line. They became subject to it by birth or nationality. In other words, all the Jews were answerable to the law of Moses essentially from the day they were born. In other words, they were born into being Jews. It says, at the age of 8, every male child was circumcised. And this sign placed him under the law and bound him to be subject to it. He had no individual choice in the matter. Otherwise, he would be an outcast from his people. In other words, if a Jew decided he didn't want to follow the law of Moses, he couldn't keep being a Jew. I mean, he could be killed, or he could be thrust out. He could, again, become an outcast. It says, thus, it was necessary for a law to be given to such a people under these conditions, so as to be plain and emphatically set forth. In other words, why were there 613 thou shalt and thou shalt nots? Why? Well, the reason was that God knew the nature of the people to whom He was giving this law, and He knew that He had to spell out every single detail, because they were what they were by birth and not by choice. So God gave the law of Moses, and in essence addressed every single situation that might arise. Different kinds of sin. Leviticus chapters 4, 5, and 6. Different kinds of sacrifice. Leviticus, again, the entirety of the book of Leviticus. Different types of offerings that were different than sin offerings. Wave offerings, heave offerings, drink offerings, firstborn offerings. You know, the priesthood. And who did what within the confines of the priesthood. Laws about sexual impurity, covering all the gamut. From fornication to adultery to homosexuality to bestiality. They're all listed. Laws against witchcraft and sorcery. In other words, God had to spell this thing because of the nature of the Jewish people. Not that they were born, with an inherited poor nature, but because they had lived so long in Egypt and had become so rebellious, God had to spell everything out for them. They couldn't be trusted just to give general laws like we are given in Christianity today. What are you going to say, Johnny?
You see this today when you talk to somebody and they say, when you start, and they ultimately argue with you over what is right, they'll say, doesn't say you can, but doesn't say you can't.
There you go.
See, you pick and choose, do what you want.
Yeah, people,
It's in your nature.
It is in human nature to want specific guidelines so that we can always know beyond a shadow of a doubt if we're in the right or in the wrong.
Built-in safety.
We consider it a safety net. All right, I think about Shannon. Shannon works for UPS. UPS has their workers have a contract. So if there's ever a dispute between labor and management, then you go to the contract, and those contracts are about this thick, and they spell out basically every possible scenario that a laborer can have with the management, and therefore it being specifically laid forth, then there's no question. And so both management and labor have safety, security in the fact that they can know that what they're doing is either in accordance or not in accordance with the contract. And yet, the contracts still sometimes fall short. And therein lies the problem. Therein lies the problem. And so when we're thinking about the Jews, and this is where this book goes, John. I don't know if you've read that far ahead in this lesson. But Stroop says, here's the problem. Is that people nowadays, they want a law of Moses. They want a specified course of action that dictates every single aspect of life and godliness. Now, put your thinking caps on. What is the problem with having that? In other words, what would be the problem if God had, in His new covenant, given us 613, in other words, if God had directly spoken to every possible scenario that might be faced by the Christian and how to deal with it accordingly, what would be the problem with that?
Well, you can't get them to read what we got today. It's very thin.
Well, that would be one thing.
The book would be about that thick.
Well, that might be true. That might be true.
If they explained each one, what I get.
I understand. The book could be too thick. All right.
You can't get them to read a little bit.
But I'm talking about with regard to human nature. What's the problem? What's the problem with God spelling out everything?
Couldn't keep it back then.
Yeah, number one, they couldn't keep it back then.
They couldn't keep it today.
And you couldn't do it today. Now we're going with this. Now, Lynn's on the right track. Did people in that day think they could keep it perfectly?
You know, they thought they did.
Did the Pharisees think that they could keep it perfectly?
They thought they did.
That's exactly right. The Pharisees, and this is from Luke 18, trusted in themselves that they were righteous. Based on what? Not their adherence to the law, but to their adherence to the traditions that they built as a hedge around the law. Now, by the way, sometimes I haven't used this terminology in a long time, and I want to make sure everybody understands. And I wish if I had a whiteboard, I'd do it. But, well, let me just use this piece of paper right here. Everybody can see this. All right?
Well, they pushed leniency as far as they could.
Now this dot represents the law of Moses. Right? Just assume for a moment that this dot represents the entirety of the law of Moses. All 613 thou shalt and thou shalt not. Right? One of those was you cannot work on the Sabbath. But then the question arose, what constitutes work? You couldn't kindle a fire. You couldn't pick up sticks. But what constituted work on the Sabbath? Well, because it wasn't specifically spelled out, the Pharisees said, well, you can only walk so far from your house on the Sabbath. Remember in the New Testament, you see the phrase, a Sabbath day's journey? There's nothing in the law of God about a Sabbath day's journey. That was a purely contrived Jewish tradition that you could only walk, and I think it might have been 6/10 of a mile or something like that. But you couldn't walk more. If you walked 6/10 of a mile on the Sabbath day, you were good. But the minute you did that, you were a sinner. So that's where the Sabbath day's journey came in. But then some Jews lived in the walls of the city, inside the walls. So therefore, they had a little bit different rule. As long as you didn't ever leave something that touched where you lived, it didn't count. In other words, if you lived in the wall of the city and you walked on this far, well, you're on somebody else's house, but their house is touching your house. It's kind of like when you was playing tag as a kid and somebody get on base and then what they do? Electricity, man. Electricity. If you don't have to get to the base, you can just get to me. And somebody's here, and somebody's here, and somebody's here. It all made it, right? So being here was just as good as being over here. Well, that's what the Jews did. As long as that house, that rooftop, was continuous, none of those steps counted. It's just like, you can walk all the way around the city, it's just like you never left home. But the guy that walked out the gate of the city, who only walked half as far as you did, was a sinner. So therein lies the problem. So the Jews developed a series of these. And that's what we call them hedges. In other words, by the time the Jews finished, so, man, none of these pens work. So by the time the Jews finished building all their hedges, here was their thinking. As long as I don't cross this, I'll be sure not to cross this. You see? As long as I can stay here, I don't have to worry about being in violation of here. But what did the Jews end up doing? They forgot about this and started making all this the law. Why do your disciples eat with unwashed hands? That's one of these. That's one of these. Wasn't anything in the law about eating with unwashed hands. There were laws about cleanliness. But what did the Jews do? Well, they figured out a way. By the way, if you read, I believe it's Mark 7, the Jews even had a particular way you had to wash your hands in order to get them clean. You know, it wasn't like Jeffrey, when you say, Jeffrey, did you wash your hands before you eat? He'd run to the bathroom, he might turn the water on, and he might get his hands under it, and then he comes back. And his hands are washed. Well, even if he got his hands under there for about a half a second, that for him, that's hands washing. Not good enough for he's a Jew. Jews had a special way. And literally meant to wash with the fist. To take your fist and clean that hand with your fist. And take that fist and clean your hand with your fist. And if you didn't do that, your hands weren't really clean. So they built all these hedges around the law. And so if you don't violate the hedge, you won't violate the law. The problem was the hedges became the law in the mind of the Jews. And so Jews had this idea that they could keep the law and thereby be righteous. So then their faith wasn't in God who gave them the law. Their faith was in their own perceived ability to keep the law. And therein lies the difficulty of the whole system of Judaism. Because of the nature of the people, they took what God gave them and perverted it again. But it's different with the new covenant. God didn't give, now look, the Bible says there are some things we have to do. The New Testament says there are some things we have to do. They're obligatory. You know, you must be born again. We all know what must is, right? You must be born again. God is spirit, and they that worship Him must worship Him in spirit and in truth. We all understand what must is. In other words, I'm obligated. I'm obligated. I don't have any choice in the matter. But even within that, there are some liberties, right? Worship in spirit and truth includes singing with the spirit and the understanding. I'm commanded to sing, right? Now, if I sing one song or 10 songs, the Bible doesn't say one way or the other, right? It commands me to sing. In other words, I'm left with some discretion about the matter, so long as I do it right. You know, the preaching of the preaching. You can preach 20 minutes, 30 minutes, 40 minutes, or an hour, or whatever. In other words, there's discretion there that can go even change from one week to the next. Love one another as I have loved you. Now that's a whole lot more generic command, isn't it? In other words, the only thing that's spelled out is the measuring stick. Love one another as I have loved you. Wouldn't it be a whole lot easier if He just gave me a list of 10 things that I had to do to show that I love my brother? That'd be a whole lot easier, wouldn't it? But if He gave me that list of 10 things, and then I checked off those 10 things off my list, then look at me. I'm a good person. I've kept the command to love my brother as Christ has loved me, because I've got all 10 things checked off on my list. And you know what I've become? A modern day Jew. A modern day Pharisee. And so the failure to understand the nature of the people to whom the covenants are given is vital. A Jew was a Jew just by reason of physical birth. No one chose to be a Jew. But the covenant of Christ is one that's given to people who are not already in the covenant. And thereby people have to make a choice to become members or partakers of that covenant. Which means that there is a mindset that a man must have before he can be a part of that covenant. There was no mindset that a man had to be a Jew, right? There was no mindset. He was one from the moment that he came out of his mother's womb. That's what he was. But to be a Christian is a choice. It's a choice. It's a choice based on the information that is given about what it means to be a Christian. It's a choice that involves, as Luke 14 tells us, of counting the cost. What are my obligations? What is the standard to which I'm going to be held? Well, the answer to that is always easy. The standard is Christ. The standard to which I'm going to be held is the standard of Christ. It's the standard of what His Word says. He who rejects me and receives not my words has one that judges him. The words that I have spoken, the same will judge him in the last day. And the words that He spoke included, love one another as I have loved you. And so the problem that people have nowadays is they want a law of Moses-like covenant. But God didn't give us that. Because He didn't give the covenant to people who were already by birth or by without choice a member of it. And so let's look down at let's see here. Well, I'm just going to read this next paragraph here on 193. Another special need for its exactness, talking about the old law. Another special need for its exactness in statement was occasioned by the fact that punishment was the principal motivating force, and this was to be administered by man himself. You know, he shall be cut off from among the people. He shall be taken out and stoned. An eye for an eye. He shall flee to the cities of refuge. In other words, all the punishments, all the consequences of law breaking fell into the hands of mankind. On the other hand, the law of Christ is to all men who will believe it and who in love accept it. Each individual who is to interpret and apply this teaching in his life has accepted it voluntarily, being led to do so by the goodness of God and having no right whatsoever to administer punishment to others because of their failure to live in keeping with the teaching. Neither is he to fear punishment from others because of his own failings or transgressions. Now this is where a lot of the people in the world misunderstand Christianity. They think that we want, and I'm using the term Christianity in a broad sense, all right? They think that we want to force people to live like we live. Now look, if we are practicing true Christianity, we would never under any circumstances attempt to force a person to live like we live. Ever. The Bible never enjoins it upon Christians to coerce other people to live like they live. Rather, we are commanded to live in such a way as to create an interest in living like we live. I mean, sanctify the Lord God in your heart and be ready to give an answer to every man who asks a reason of the hope that lies within you with meekness and fear, 1 Peter 3:15. But those, in particular on the far left, have an inordinate fear of Christianity. Now, is that to say that there aren't some who, and again I'm using the term Christianity in a broad sense, is that to say that there aren't some who would try to force Christianity on people? The very idea of human nature says that some people will try to do that, right? You know, for example, and I'll get in trouble for saying this, but I'm going to say it anyway. There's not a nickel's worth of difference in radical Islam today and the Catholic Church of 500 to 600 years. There's not a nickel's worth of difference in it. Both of them sought by force to coerce people to live in the way that they prescribed people to live. The Catholic Church ain't 5 cents difference in them and the radical Islamists. Both perfectly willing to kill people to enforce their faith. Same goes for some in the Reformation movement. You think about, for example, the wars that took place in the United Kingdom over being an Anglican or being a Catholic. An Anglican wasn't nothing but a popeless Catholic. It wasn't a nickel's worth of difference, except where your allegiances were. Either you gave allegiance to the Archbishop of Canterbury and the King, or you gave your allegiance to the Pope. But so far as what they believed in practice, there wasn't a nickel's worth of difference. But depending on who was the king or who was the queen, determined which religion was going to be practiced. And every time there was a switch, a lot of people died. In other words, when a new group came to power, the people that used to be in power, they died. They were oppressed. So we wouldn't be so foolish as to think that just because a person professes Christianity, they wouldn't try to force it on somebody. I'm just saying, when people practice genuine Christianity, look, not even the communist Chinese government has anything to fear from genuine Christianity. Is that right? That's exactly right. Christianity can exist and flourish with any governmental form, whether it be a monarchy or communism or socialism or representative republic. Christianity is made to live and exist in all of those things. Why? Because Christians, by and large, should not be concerned with the things of the world. In other words, just leave me alone and let me practice my religion. I'll pay my taxes. I'll honor the king. I'll be submissive to the authorities. Just leave me alone and I'll be a good citizen. Right? All right, time's up. We'll pick up back there next week.